Welcome to Aequi, the podcast on all things law and technology. I'm Tima.
I'm Paul, and on this episode, your smart home is a snitch.
Hello and welcome to the third episode of the surveillance series. I think we can all agree that a smart home is a surveilled home. I think it's pretty much inevitable that if you have an Alexa or Google Nest or home security cameras or those cameras that watch your dog while you're at work or anything like that, you are basically accepting the fact that all of this information about what happens in your home and maybe outside the surroundings of your home are being recorded, are being transmitted, are being stored and things like that.
I mean, it's literally called a surveillance camera, so it's right in the name. And we really want to look in this episode into the smart home and what data is it collecting and how it is especially sharing this information with law enforcement.
So I think the first question when it comes to smart homes that people always consider, I know I have, I don't have an Alexa, I don't have any really smart home appliances because my biggest concern is this going to be monitoring my every move? And are smart home devices recording all the time?
Yeah, and I find this often online. Like this has become some kind of a meme that Alexa is always listening to you, and there's these stories of people, privately talking about something and then getting an ad of this and thinking this was because of the Alexa in the room or any other of these voice assistants, right? This is the same with the Apple HomePod or Google Home or even on your phones because you can also voice activate them.
Exactly. And I think a lot of mistrust around these smart home devices and specifically Amazon's Alexa have happened because there have been quite a few controversial or public breaches, I guess you could call them that. I mean, in 2018, there was this case of an Amazon customer who requested his archived data from Amazon. And he didn't even have an Alexa. He just wanted like the information from Amazon Prime, right? And he was sent all of this information, and he was also sent 1,700 audio recordings from somebody else's Alexa. And he listened to this and he was like, why am I being given this information? This is not me. And I read the article basically where he was interviewed and he said that he heard personal conversations, them asking for the weather, asking for travel details, like all of these different things about someone else's life. So I think that causes a lot of concern for people, for sure.
Yeah, but is Alexa always listening?
The short answer is no.
But also a bit yes.
Yeah. Amazon says no, but I'm inclined to believe that potentially yes, because it all depends on that voice command, right? So Alexa is, according to Amazon's privacy policy, Alexa is dormant or asleep until you give the wake up command, which is hello Alexa or echo or whatever. And then Alexa starts to record just so it can collect the information that you ask and process and give you the correct response.
So it's kind of always hearing what you say, but it's not recording this and not storing this and not processing this until you say the command, and then it gets recorded and then it gets sent off to Amazon.
Yes. And I think the issue that a lot of people get caught up in is that they say the command and then conversation happens around them. So it's not necessarily that when you command, other people around you are not talking or other things aren't happening. So all that background noise will also get recorded.
But I feel like that this isn't as bad as it might seem because it's there's this indicator light, but also it's kind of like I would expect this. Like it's logical that if I say the command and it is being recorded, then there's other stuff on it as well.
Exactly.
Or if it mishears and thinks it's a command and
exactly.
activates.
So that's very true. And I mean, you can switch it off. So it's not necessarily that you have to have it on all the time. Even on kind of waiting to hear a command type of mode, you can just switch the entire device off completely. And then at that stage, you know that there's no chance of an error of you mistakenly saying echo and it starts recording or something like that.
And I also think that once you're past this voice or this always recording point, it doesn't really make much of a difference if it's a voice-based command or if it's just on your phone, right? The amount of monitoring is essentially the same. Like, it doesn't matter if you do a voice command saying, hey, what's the weather in Vienna today? Or if you're looking it up on the phone, it's the same data,
Exactly,
essentially.
it is the same thing. And I mean, you can delete the recordings as well. So Amazon has a function where you can actually go and listen to all the recordings that Alexa or that they have stored of you, and you can delete what you find uncomfortable, or if mistakenly it was on, you can still get rid of it. So essentially, there are ways to combat this notion that your smart devices are always listening to you, but also if you're kind of careless about it, then it can be a situation where you're recorded without really being aware.
Now, law enforcement has also recently focused on this data, right? So they have increasingly accessed this data. And I think this is very interesting on why they're doing this, because I wouldn't have expected this, actually. I didn't even think of it. But it is being used as evidence, for example, for people being at certain places, right?
Yes, exactly. So like to back up an alibi, for example. So if you said maybe I was at home at that time, they might look into it and see where you were, things like that. I mean, there was a case in the US in 2015 of a man who was accused of murder, and information from his Amazon Echo was allowed as evidence in trial to essentially prove his innocence. But so the law enforcement requested it from Amazon, and initially Amazon said no, based on fundamental rights and things like that and the privacy of their customer. But then the accused actually said, no, please give them the information, because he thought that it would help him to prove his innocence.
And I think this is true for all smart home devices, is they can especially well prove at least someone's location, right? So if you're single, live alone, and you need to prove that you were home at a certain time, ordering a pizza via voice command or changing your thermostats or unlocking your smart lock or whatever might be a good alibi.
Exactly. So in that sense, it could be helpful, but there also, is the potential threat in the context of law enforcement that intelligence agencies or state actors find a way to kind of interfere with your smart home devices without you knowing, and essentially alter the functionalities in such a way that they can use it as surveillance.
Obviously, like, you have the hardware installed, and if there is some kind of way to manipulate the software in a way to extract the data for law enforcement purposes, then this might be used.
Yeah. And I mean, I think people are also concerned because increasingly these technology companies are entering into partnerships with law enforcement, right? So when things like that happen, I think often the consumers kind of like, wait, so you have a partnership with law enforcement. How do I know that my information is going to be protected from that if you have a vested interest in continuing this relationship that you have with law enforcement, which means providing them with information?
Yeah, so I think this is a difficult relationship. And it is especially interesting one with the doorbell company Ring, right? So these are these smart doorbells that also have a video function and always record when it senses motion, or it works something like this, right?
Yeah, so essentially Ring has a partnership with law enforcement, and so it creates kind of a law enforcement portal for law enforcement, where they can see where all the Ring cameras in their jurisdiction are located. And then if a crime happens in a specific area or an incident is reported in a specific area, law enforcement can then request from Ring video footage from that specific camera at that specific area. And then Ring is then in the position to decide or let the camera owner know about this and give them the chance to decide or not decide whether to share this information.
I think it's really interesting that they're more or less building this decentralized surveillance network of like private citizens just installing this for their own security or because it's just convenient, and this being then used for law enforcement purposes.
Exactly, when that's really not your intention when you purchase this, but then you're put in a situation where you can be involved in solving a crime.
Yeah, and people are happy to do that.
Yeah,
and
people
this
are
is
really happy to do that.
Because it is weird in like the concept that you are being asked to consent for your data to be used, but it's actually because they're tracking someone else. So you're consenting for someone else.
You're consenting for somebody else's kind of whereabouts to be monitored by the police through your device that you purchased.
And I mean, this is a very American thing, isn't it?
Super American.
So, like, they also have this kind of social network where every ring owner in the neighborhood is being connected, and you can share suspicious activities that you want, which is super weird. And all of this not really for any major crimes, right? This is like at most people breaking in, but most probably just, people stealing packages from front doors.
Yeah, it takes Neighborhood Watch. You know those little Neighborhood Watch WhatsApp groups that started happening and Neighborhood Watch get-togethers? It takes it to a whole new level, because now you can actually actively participate with the law enforcement agency and let them know what's going on and give them access to information whenever you want using this interface.
Yeah, and everybody becomes a bit of a detective themselves.
Yes, and it can become borderline problematic when, for example, people in the neighborhood start taking matters into their own hands or start taking the law into their own hands because they feel like they are part of this investigation process. And people can take things overboard.
They do. But I think it's interesting from a psychological point of view as well. Like, just if this was government mandated, like everywhere has to be a security camera and they have to cooperate, then this would have been completely different. And if it's like, hey, you already have this because it's convenient, why don't you share this with us?
And I exactly what you're saying. I read an article where it was the police chief in a specific area where there were a lot of Ring cameras and they had entered into this partnership with Ring. And he was essentially saying, well, the customer buys this camera and they want to do this, and it's not like we are imposing it on them. They buy the camera, they participate in this network, they join in, and he kind of made it seem like it's not really a privacy issue because everybody involved kind of consents to be involved. But I think they don't acknowledge the fact that you essentially consent to verifying the whereabouts of somebody else.
Yeah, so you're building a network to surveil someone else and not you specifically.
Exactly. So yeah, it's really interesting. And I think it's also interesting that as time has gone on and as law enforcement has, gotten more involved with smart home devices, a lot of these technology companies started releasing, were kind of felt it necessary to release transparency reports, essentially saying the number of requests that they get from law enforcement agencies and how many of these requests they actually go through with, how many they reject, and what the whole thing looks like. And I'll be honest, the transparency reports are not that transparent. The one that I'm specifically talking about is Amazon's report from the 2020, the period from the 1st of July to the 31st of December. Firstly, for a company like Amazon, you would expect that a transparency report of this nature would be more than 3 pages. But it's literally only 3 pages long. And maybe just like 2 and a bit. I don't think the third page is a full third page. And essentially it says that Amazon received over 27,000 requests for data collected by Amazon products. And of that, they didn't give information in all the cases. So I think it was about 15% of the cases that they actually ended up giving the information that was requested.
But this seems kind of low in my opinion, right?
That's what I thought. I thought that was quite low, and they did it in terms of demographics. So this is in the whole world, and Germany was a huge chunk of the requests. I think 41% of the requests came from Germany, and for me, 27,000 does not seem like a lot if we're looking at the whole world context. And then they separated between Amazon Web Services and then just Amazon products in general, and yeah, so essentially they say, the kind of information that they would give out on request would be user info, your name, address, email, billing information, retail purchase history, and any information that's connected with Amazon Web Services. But what's interesting to me is they don't actually specify which departments or which forms of law enforcement requested this information. So you never know if it's, just the police requesting this or if it's special government agencies or if it's Homeland Security. Like you don't know, and it's very vague.
And not if it's terrorism or if it's just, petty crime.
Exactly. So they don't say in relation to what. these requests were made. They don't even specify if it was subpoenas or search warrants or court orders. It's like I said, it's not a very transparency report, but at least it's there if you want to have a look at it.
I also think it's really interesting that 40% of this was Germany, because I feel like most of this, and especially law enforcement having access to this, is a very US American thing. And I found this in the cooperation policy of Ring with law enforcement. They provide a form for law enforcement to fill out in order to request data. And they only have this for the US. And if you're from any other country, because Ring is a US company, you have to go through, you can't contact them directly, but you have to go through the Department of Justice and like international criminal cooperation.
Oh, I see.
So this also places a focus on the US, really, because only there, at least for some companies, it is possible to request this data easily.
I think that makes sense, because most of the cases where, it's public knowledge that law enforcement has gotten access to data coming from smart home devices, most of the cases that I saw were in the US. Found it really difficult to find any European examples or African examples. So I feel like this is definitely more of an American phenomenon, but maybe something that will spread into the rest of the world.
I looked into the law in Austria, so the criminal procedural code, and it is quite interesting that there is some legal discussion around whether this is like live surveillance, so interfering with live communication, so like reading your SMS or listening to your calls, or if it's just like the seizure of any other object, just that it's data. And the tendency is towards the latter. And the interesting point there is that it doesn't need a court order. So the public prosecutor is enough to order this, and then the company, so the platform, has to comply, which also makes it interesting because it's not the actual data subject, it's not the owner of the data, but it's a third party that is providing this data.
Do they make that distinction because interception is not required?
Yeah, well, it's not really an interception after it's been transmitted.
And stored.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's much easier because you don't need this court order.
I think it's a really interesting area, and there's not much kind of legally, I would say, outside of the US. I mean, in the African context, there's not much legally that really talks to this, and there are not that many cases to look at to see kind of what the court has said about how they will treat this going forward. So I think this is a really interesting area that's going to keep developing, especially as more and more people get more and more smart devices in their homes. And I think it will be interesting to see how this goes moving forward. Yeah,
definitely, especially because the more data you have, and if this goes into smart cars and location services and so on, it really becomes a lot more evidence for law enforcement to investigate, even if it's not live surveillance for watching somebody, but just after the fact for crime investigation.
Okay, so if we're to ask the question, Paul, is your smart home snitching on you? What do you say? Yes or no?
Yes, to a certain extent.
I agree. To a certain extent, but you can control what is saved and what is not saved, and you can go and take the extra step and delete things and review files, but I don't see a lot of people doing that.
No, and I mean, this is a general privacy practice, essentially, is true for this as well. So try to avoid having a lot of data about you, delete the data, and if you're worried about this, don't buy the product.
Yes. Well, thank you guys for listening, and we hope to catch you on another episode of the Aequi podcast. Bye.
Bye. Aequi is hosted by Tima Anwana and me, Paul Eberstaller. We are brought to you by the Department of Innovation and Digitalization in Law at the University of Vienna.
Thank you for listening, and see you next time.